Welcome to the research desk.
It is great to be here to dive into this one.
I want you to imagine that it is 1958. You are walking into a major museum in Paris, or, perhaps London or Berlin.
Okay, I can picture that. The post-war European art scene.
Exactly. You step into this sprawling, prestigious gallery, and you find yourself staring at a massive, chaotic canvas. It is covered in these explosive, muscular splatters of paint.
A classic abstract expressionist piece.
Right. And the museum plaque, the curators, the entire institutional weight of the art world, they all tell you that you are looking at an entirely new, unprecedented Western invention. They call it abstract art.
And the narrative is that a handful of avant-garde European and American painters basically woke up, severed the ancient tie between painting and representation, and birthed a completely original way of making a mark.
That is the exact story. But what if that museum plaque is off by about, 1,000 years?
That is a massive historical claim.
It is. Today we are examining a foundational historical mystery. We have to ask, did abstraction actually emerge centuries earlier? Did it emerge wherever writing was pushed so far towards speed, force, and spirit that the physical mark began to matter as much as the word itself?
Which sets up our core tension perfectly.
Yes, it does. I will be arguing the bull case today. I am arguing that ancient calligraphy is humanity's original abstract art. It is a tradition that recognized the expressive autonomy of the line long before the modern era. If abstraction means the reduction and liberation of form from descriptive obligation, well then calligraphy got there first.
And I will be joining you to argue the bear case. I understand the immense appeal of that bull case narrative, I really do. It feels like a necessary historical correction to a very Eurocentric view of art.
It absolutely is a necessary correction.
But when we actually stress test this premise with historical data and look closely at the mechanics of these traditions, we find a massive structural flaw. Mistaking writing that has been intensified for painting that has been detached from depiction fundamentally misunderstands the ontology of the art form.
So you are saying it is a category error?
A profound category error. Historically, Western abstract art emerged from a highly specific philosophical break, the outright refusal of direct representation as the central task of painting. Calligraphy, regardless of its visual intensity or how unreadable it becomes to the untrained eye, abstracts within writing. It does not abstract away from meaning.
Well, to understand why this comparison even exists in the first place, we have to look closely at the narrative that entrenched this Western standard. Let us go back to that moment in 1958.
The MoMA tour.
Yes, the Museum of Modern Art in New York orchestrated this massive traveling exhibition. It was titled The New American Painting. And this was not just an art show. It was a heavily funded, geopolitically motivated tour.
It was touring a Europe that was still rebuilding from the Second World War. It was an enormous institutional flex.
Exactly. It stopped in Basel, Milan, Madrid, Berlin, Paris, and London. And this exhibition successfully canonized abstract expressionism as a distinctly modern, unprecedented Western breakthrough.
They presented artists like Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and Franz Kline as singular geniuses.
Singular geniuses who were supposedly summoning gestural non-mimesis entirely out of nothing. And for our listeners, when we say non-mimesis, we are talking about art that is not trying to copy or represent the real world.
It is pure movement, pure paint, pure physical action captured on a canvas.
Right. The narrative MoMA built was predicated entirely on Rupture. It was about total originality. These artists were supposedly breaking free from the burden of thousands of years of art history. So what actually happened? Think about this for a second.
The institutional framing demanded that audiences view this explosive mark-making as the absolute vanguard of human expression.
But the blind spot of that 1958 narrative is staggering. When you consider the broader global history of the brush, it claimed an absolute monopoly on the expressive line. It entirely ignored the fact that across the world, non-mimetic gestural forms had been cultivated, theorized, and perfected for over a millennium.
I will certainly concede that the MoMA narrative was a masterpiece of geopolitical, cultural framing. I mean, the United States was in the middle of the Cold War.
Right. They needed a cultural weapon.
Exactly. They needed to project an image of ultimate freedom, individualism, and boundless innovation to counter Soviet realism. And what better way to do that than by exporting massive canvases filled with wild, unrestricted paint?
It was brilliant marketing.
It was. The dismantling MoMA's claim to total, vacuum-sealed originality requires us to establish a very precise common ground here. We need to agree on how marks actually function on a surface.
I'm with you. Lay out the common ground.
There are 3 indisputable points about mark making that complicate that 1958 narrative. The first is that calligraphy is never exhausted by its legibility. Meaning operates simultaneously on semantic, kinetic, and cultural levels.
So the stroke communicates the written word, but also exactly how that word was executed physically?
Precisely. Second, gesture carries deep information independently of easy reading. Brush pressure, the speed of the wrist, the hesitation before a turn, all of that communicates the temperament and the immediate emotional intention of the maker.
Which is why a viewer can feel the energy in a piece of ancient calligraphy without knowing a single character of the language.
Yes. But the third point is the crucial wedge in our disagreement. Resemblance does not equal equivalence. Pre-modern calligraphy and modern abstraction share a striking formal logic. They both utilize expressive lines and the autonomy of human gesture.
But you are going to say they do not share the same historical purpose.
Exactly. In calligraphy, writing is almost never canceled. In modern Western painting, the gesture itself is isolated and becomes the sole subject. The image is canceled.
I hear you emphasizing that the historical purpose is different. But we have to look at what happened almost immediately after that moment tour. Within a decade, leading Western critics and even the artists themselves began realizing something profound.
What did they realize?
They realized that the calligraphic line had not vanished in modern abstraction. It had actually returned as a missing ancestry. When we restrict the definition of abstraction solely to the 20th century avant-garde rejection of representation, we are artificially narrowing the parameters. We are forcing it to fit a European timeline.
So how do you define it then?
If we redefine abstraction more accurately as the liberation of form, the distillation of physical energy, and the elevation of gesture over mere description, well, the historical timeline shifts dramatically backward.
Let us look at the actual data then. Where are you anchoring this timeline?
Let us examine the emergence of Caoshu, commonly translated as grass script. This developed during the Han Dynasty, so we are talking between 206 BCE and 220 CE.
That is a massive chronological leap backward.
It is. To set the context, the Han Dynasty was a massive, expanding empire. It required an enormous bureaucracy. And because of that, writing simply had to become faster.
Efficiency driving innovation.
Exactly. But what began as a speed-driven transformation of Chinese writing evolved into something entirely different. Characters were aggressively abbreviated. Individual strokes that used to be separate were fused together into continuous, looping lines.
The rigid, structural constraints of standard official script were essentially compressed.
And the physical, biomechanical movement of the brush was intensely magnified. We really have to understand how this worked physically. The scribe is holding a brush made of animal hair. It is loaded with liquid ink made of pine soot.
And as they move faster, the brush lifts, presses, twists, and drags across the paper or silk.
Yes, and the ink skips. It leaves these dry, white streaks, known in the tradition as flying white. This was not merely an exercise in efficient handwriting for busy bureaucrats.
You are saying it transcended its utility.
Completely. In its most extreme forms, the written sign was pushed past legibility into a sheer field of force. The line ceases to be a mere vehicle for the word. It becomes a physical event. The viewer is confronted with a visual energy that moves aggressively to the foreground.
I listened to your description of the visual energy, the physics of the brush, this phenomenon of flying white, and, well, it is undeniably accurate to the visual experience. The sensory reality of looking at grass script is breathtaking.
It truly is.
But your analysis misses the structural anchor that holds the entire system together. Legibility always remains somewhere within the architecture of that mark.
Even when it is completely unreadable to the average person.
Yes, because the practitioners of grass script were not trying to abolish the semantic anchor. They were trying to stretch it to its absolute tensile limit. This is a vital mechanical distinction.
A distinction of intent, you mean?
A distinction of mathematical derivation. Even when a complex Chinese character is abbreviated into a single continuous, breathless loop of ink, that specific loop is mathematically and philosophically derived from the standard structure of the character.
So it cannot just be any loop.
Exactly. If you alter the trajectory of that loop by a fraction of an inch, it ceases to be that character. It becomes gibberish. Therefore, the abstraction you are perceiving is an abstraction of efficiency and momentum.
It is an abstraction of continuous motion.
Right. But it is not an abstraction of nullification. When a Western modernist, a century later, paints at black square or splashes industrial enamel paint across a rock canvas, they are making a loud, declarative statement.
That the painting refers to nothing outside its own physical reality.
Exactly. It is a closed loop. But when a Han Dynasty scholar executes grass script, no matter how wild or illegible it appears to the uninitiated, the text still fundamentally references the poem or the political letter or the imperial edict. The referent is never destroyed.
Okay, but consider what happened when that technique evolved even further. Look at the legendary Tang Dynasty masters from the 8th century. I am talking specifically about Zhangsu and Huaisu.
The wild cursive masters?
Yes. These men were not celebrated for their tidy clarity or their bureaucratic utility. They were famous precisely for their wild cursive intensity.
Historical accounts from the period describe their calligraphy as an unpredictable, explosive event.
That is putting it mildly. Zhangsu was famously known as Crazy Zhang. He was known to drink massive amounts of wine, and in a state of sheer ecstasy, he would use his own ink-soaked hair as a brush, thrashing his head across the silk.
That is certainly a chaotic, embodied performance.
It is the ultimate performance. Their calligraphy was a direct record of human breath, intoxication, supreme muscular control, and sudden, violent release.
It was an event as much as a text.
Exactly. Now, to the uninitiated observer, and frankly, even to many highly literate observers of their own time, parsing the exact characters was completely secondary. The primary experience was feeling the sheer vitality, the energetic life force, the chi of the ink on the page.
I understand the visceral appeal of that.
If abstraction means the mark acquiring expressive autonomy, this is abstraction in a profound, undeniable sense. They elevated human gesture into a bearer of raw feeling. It was completely untethered from the obligation to meticulously depict visible reality.
You are seeing it as a pure emotional record.
When I look at a Zhangsu scroll, I am looking at the physical evidence of an emotional state, not just a transcribed poem.
That performative intensity is beautiful. And those historical accounts of Zhangsu are certainly captivating. But it still operates under a fundamentally different ontological framework than Western abstraction.
How so? The visual result is pure non-mimetic energy.
Let us expand the map beyond China to test this structural counterargument. Because this phenomenon is not isolated. Look at the tradition of Arabic Khat, the high art of Islamic calligraphy.
Okay, let us look at Khat.
Here, the script transformed into intricate architecture, geometry, and boundless flow. The letters stretch, interlock, and fold back on themselves. They become the very spatial organizing principle of manuscripts, ceramics, and the walls of mosques.
It is incredibly visually complex.
It is. Yet in Khat, the text functions simultaneously as language, ornament, and spiritual order. The perfection of the geometry is not an aesthetic game. It is a direct reflection of divine perfection.
So it is spiritually functional.
Yes. It absolutely does not exist to sever form from language. And that severance, that intentional breaking of the tie between the image and the meaning, is the defining requisite characteristic of Western abstraction.
So the rebellion is the key for you.
Yes. When a Western artist severs form from language, They are actively rebelling against an inherited European tradition of religious dogma or historical depiction. When a master of Arabic Khat manipulates a letter form until it becomes a complex, interwoven geometric mandala, they are not rebelling against meaning.
They are manifesting it.
Exactly. They are manifesting meaning in its highest possible register. The primary motivation is profound reverence, not rupture.
I see the distinction you are drawing regarding purpose and reverence. But the core paradox remains fascinating to me.
What paradox?
Across entirely different global traditions, whenever writing is pushed to its absolute highest level of refinement, it almost always exceeds mere transcription. Let us look at Japanese Shodo.
The way of the brush.
Right. Over centuries, the simple act of putting a brush to paper developed into a highly disciplined performance. The resulting line becomes physical evidence of cultivated emptiness.
You were talking about the concept of mushin?
Yes, mushin. Now for our listeners, mushin translates roughly to no mind. Think of it like the ultimate flow state experienced by an elite athlete, but applied to the precise micro-movements of a brush.
The body executes the stroke without conscious linguistic interference.
Exactly, without overthinking. The resulting mark on the paper is a raw, unedited trace of the practitioner's internal state at that exact millisecond.
It is a biomechanical record.
It is, and the more perfect the mark, the more it leaves behind the mundane, utilitarian function of the word. If the stated intent of the artist is a state of mental emptiness, and the visual result is a highly expressive visual record of that internal energy, it becomes incredibly difficult to argue that this is not a form of abstract art.
But you are only arriving at that conclusion because it originated from a linguistic character, and you are ignoring the system it lives in.
I am looking at the visual reality of the line.
But it is not difficult at all to separate them if you maintain strict philosophical hygiene regarding the terms we are employing. This brings us precisely to the bear case and the massive ontological category era I mentioned at the very beginning of our discussion.
All right, lay out the category error.
Historically, Western abstraction, pioneered in the early 20th century by figures like Wassily Kandinsky and Kazimir Malevich, was a highly specific, calculated philosophical break.
They were operating in a Europe that was hurtling toward industrial mechanization.
Yes, and World War. Their refusal of direct representation as the central task of painting was revolutionary. They were actively trying to invent a completely new language of art after depiction.
They wanted to paint the spiritual or the invisible.
Right. They wanted to do that without relying on painting trees, people, or buildings. Calligraphy, by absolute contrast, abstracts within writing. It never abandons the word. Judging pre-modern calligraphy solely by modern Western standards of abstract art is like evaluating an ancient Chinese medicine remedy strictly by modern pharmaceutical criteria.
That is an interesting analogy. How does that work?
Well, a pharmaceutical lab might analyze the herbal remedy, isolate the active ingredients, and declare that it functions just like a synthetic painkiller.
It detects the active ingredients, the speed of the line, the non-representational forms, the stark contrast of ink on paper.
But it misses the holistic system.
It entirely misses the vast, interconnected systemic framework that gives those ingredients their true meaning. By forcing ancient calligraphy into the mid-century box of abstract art, you are essentially telling a profound tradition that its highest possible value is that it visually resembles a 1950s New York painting.
You think it is a reductive framing.
It is a reductive, retroactive framing. It braids together ethics, statecraft, poetry, philosophy, and personal self-cultivation. And then you just flatten it to fit a modern gallery aesthetic. Wait, hold on. I need to push back here. Because I am with you on the visual similarity, but I am really struggling with this ontology argument.
What is the struggle? It is a fundamental difference in what the object actually is.
Are you saying that because a Tang Dynasty scholar intended to write a poem, or because an Islamic calligrapher intended to write a sacred verse, that I, as a modern viewer, am simply not allowed to view the final, splattered, chaotic ink as an abstract painting?
I am saying it is historically inaccurate to label it as such.
But does the original centuries-old intent truly override the visual reality and the sensory reception of the object today? If a modern viewer walks into a gallery, stands before a massive, wild cursive scroll, cannot read a single character of the script, but feels the profound rhythmic force, hasn't that piece functioned practically, effectively as abstract art?
Functioning effectively for a modern viewer does not change its original ontology.
But the artifact is communicating to the viewer through pure form, line, and composition. The creator's statecraft and ethical cultivation are totally invisible to the modern viewer, but the kinetic energy is violently, immediately present.
You are prioritizing a modern, uninitiated aesthetic experience over historical truth.
I am saying we have to acknowledge that an object's life extends far beyond its original intended context. If the visual reality of a 1,000-year-old scroll operates on the human nervous system through the exact same neurological and visual mechanisms as a 1950s Franz Kline painting, insisting that they occupy entirely separate universes feels incredibly pedantic.
Pedantic?
Yes, it feels like we are ignoring what our eyes are telling us.
It is not pedantic. It is historically rigorous, and it is crucial that we maintain that rigor, because if we ignore original intent, we fall victim to the geopolitical flattening that happens so frequently and so destructively in the global art market.
You're talking about the commodification of the art.
Yes, validating calligraphy by eagerly labeling it the original abstract art sounds like a compliment, right? It sounds like an elevation of the form.
It brings it into the global canon.
But it is actually a subtle, deeply insidious hierarchy. It dictates that calligraphy only matters, or matters most, because it happens to resemble the Western canon. It retroactively recruits older non-Western traditions to prop up a modern Western narrative.
I see the danger there.
We saw this exact institutional wildcard play out during the massive market boom of the 1980s and 1990s. As China opened economically to the world, Western dealers, auction houses, and collectors began looking at Chinese ink painting.
And they had to figure out how to sell it to Western buyers.
Exactly. And they explicitly interpreted it through the lens of abstract expressionism. Brushwork from contemporary and historical Chinese artists was aggressively compared to Jackson Pollock or Franz Kline.
It was a very common comparison in those gallery catalogs.
Right, and this was not a profound art historical revelation on the part of the galleries. It was a highly calculated brand repositioning exercise. It was cultural repackaging designed to make foreign, complex art easily legible and financially valuable to wealthy Western buyers.
They needed a visual shorthand.
They sacrificed deep philosophical context for a quick, digestible visual shorthand. They translated millennia of scholastic lineage and rigorous discipline into the catchy phrase spontaneous abstraction, simply to move inventory.
I hear what you are saying about the market manipulating the narrative to sell paintings. I acknowledge the somewhat cynical market mechanics you were describing there. But didn't that tactic only work because there is actually a genuine underlying truth to it?
A truth to the resemblance, yes, but not an equivalence.
The market translation succeeded because the resemblance is not superficial. It is rooted in a shared, profound, energetic reality. Let us think about what a brushstroke actually is at a physical level.
It is the application of ink to paper.
It is more than that. A master brushstroke acts exactly like a cryptographic or biometric signature. It encodes a unique, completely unforgeable physical act.
The velocity of the wrist, the downward pressure of the arm.
Yes, the micro-hesitations, the final follow-through, all of it is permanently, physically recorded in the line. Once the ink dries, the action is trapped. A Franz Kline painting and a Zhang Su scroll both function as polygraphs for the human body in motion.
Polygraphs for the body in motion. That is a striking way to phrase it.
It is accurate, though. The gallery market may have used that shared biometric truth as a sales tactic to appeal to New York collectors. But the tactic only succeeded because the visual data is undeniable to anyone standing in front of the artwork.
Undeniable to the eye, perhaps.
The ancient brush records the exact same economy of energy that the Western modernists spent decades trying to isolate and perfect.
The visual data of the physical movement is undeniable, yes? The body moves, the brush records. But the intention driving that physical act entirely changes the nature of the act itself.
Does it, though, if the movement is the same?
Allow me to adopt your focus on physical execution and biomechanics for a moment, because examining the physical act highlights exactly where the divergence between these two worlds occurs. The movement may be recorded biometrically, but the fundamental function of that movement is entirely different.
To truly understand the mechanics of that movement, we have to look at how complex human action is compressed into a single line. Have you seen the movie Hero?
The Zhang Yimou film from 2002. Yes, of course.
There is an incredible, vivid sequence in that film that perfectly illustrates what I am talking about regarding this kinetic transfer. In this specific sequence, martial arts swordsmanship is not taught on a dusty battlefield.
It is learned and perfected in a serene calligraphy courtyard.
Exactly. The central premise of the scene is that the brush stroke and the blade stroke are the exact same motion. They are simply executed under different physical conditions.
The physical intelligence required to wield the flexible hairbrush is biologically identical to the intelligence required to wield the heavy steel sword.
Yes, the timing, the downward pressure, the supreme confidence, the sudden restraint, the follow-through. Both arts compress incredibly complex, highly trained human action into a single flawless trajectory.
It is a stunning visual metaphor in the film.
When the calligrapher strikes the paper, that brush mark carries thrust, pause, violence, and intention long before it carries any literal reading of a word. Think about how powerful that is. The viewer of the film understands this proposition instantly.
You watch the calligrapher drag the heavy ink-soaked brush across the sand or the paper.
And you see the lethal martial intent coded directly into the friction of the bristles. This is exactly why calligraphy claims its rightful place in the prehistory of abstraction.
Because the gesture contains readable force independent of depiction.
Yes, the gesture contains pure, readable force completely independent of depiction.
That is perhaps the strongest, most elegant analogy one could make for the visual power of the calligraphic line. But if we examine it closely, it actually proves the bear case.
Wait, how does that prove the bear case?
Think about the sword thrust you just described. A sword thrust has a highly specific, functional, undeniably lethal purpose. It is designed to physically strike a target.
Right, it is functional.
It is not an abstract movement in the philosophical sense. It is a highly utilitarian movement executed with supreme grace and efficiency. Similarly, the brushstroke in calligraphy has a highly specific linguistic function.
To construct a readable character.
Exactly. It is designed to construct a readable character to convey information. A master swordsman is not engaging in non-objective performance art. They are engaging in life-or-death combat.
And a master calligrapher is writing a text.
Right. The fact that both actions are exceptionally beautiful and that both require immense, decades-long kinetic discipline does not mean they have severed their relationship with their functional reality.
But that functional reality, that ancient discipline of the brush, eventually collided head-on with the Western modernist project, and the result of that collision was explosive.
Are you talking about the mid-century cross-cultural exchanges?
Yes. To see how these two vastly different traditions interacted in the real world, we have to look at the ultimate historical collision point. Let us examine the biography of Wou-Ki.
A brilliant painter.
If you want to understand this debate, you have to look at his life. Wou-Ki was born in Beijing in 1920. From a very young age, he was trained extensively, rigorously, in traditional Chinese ink techniques and classical calligraphy.
He mastered the absolute control of the brush that we have been discussing.
He did. And then, in 1948, he boarded a ship and relocated to Paris. He arrived right into the epicenter of the post-war abstract movement. The cafes were filled with artists debating non-representation.
He walked right into the intellectual heart of Western abstraction.
Wou-Ki is the living bridge between these worlds. He took centuries of gestural intelligence, the biometric control of the traditional brush, the profound Eastern understanding of spatial emptiness, and he unleashed all of that inherited knowledge onto the modern Western canvas using oil paints.
Exactly. He is the perfect case study. And let us be incredibly precise about what Wou-Ki actually did in those Parisian studios. He did not arrive in Paris in 1948, unroll a piece of Han Dynasty grass script, point to it, and declare to the European avant-garde that calligraphy was already modern abstraction.
No, he did not just say, "We already did this."
Exactly. Instead, his mature career was a deliberate, painstaking act of translation, not a simplistic assertion of equivalence. He took the immense calligraphic discipline he learned in Beijing and actively injected it into the framework of Western abstract painting.
And the resulting canvases were absolute masterpieces.
They possessed an atmosphere and a depth that Western painters were struggling to achieve. They were unmistakably modern, and they were unmistakably indebted to the intelligence of the brush. But, and this is the crucial point, they were no longer calligraphy.
They were oil paintings.
Yes. Zhao Wou-Ki understood the boundary between the two ontologies. He crossed that boundary intentionally. He used the biomechanical tools and the spatial philosophy of one ontological category to explode the possibilities of another.
I agree entirely with that distinction. The story of Zhao Wou-Ki proves that a similarity of physical energy does not erase the massive differences in medium, function, and historical ambition.
He was translating, not copying.
Right. He proved that you could extract the kinetic intelligence of the ancient brush and apply it directly to the mid-century modernist project. And in doing so, by blending them so successfully, he exposed the very contradiction we are discussing today.
This brings us to a necessary synthesis of our debate. The persistent confusion surrounding this topic, why so many people are eager to call calligraphy abstract art, and why historians push back, stems from mixing up three completely different frameworks.
Which three frameworks?
We have to separate ontology, reception, and influence. Ontology is what the art actually is in its own historical, philosophical, and cultural context. Calligraphy is a writing-based discipline intimately intertwined with statecraft, literature, and self-cultivation. It is not Western abstract art.
And reception?
Reception is how modern, non-literate viewers see it today. To a contemporary gallery goer in London or New York, a wild cursive scroll absolutely looks abstract, and it triggers the exact same aesthetic and neurological receptors as a modern painting.
And finally, influence.
Influence is how modern artists actually borrowed from it. Western painters like Bryce Martin and cross-cultural figures like Zhao Wou-Ki directly utilize the gestural logic of calligraphy to expand what modern painting could achieve.
So conflating them is the problem.
Exactly. When we conflate these three distinct things, when we lazily say that because ancient calligraphy influenced modern abstraction, and because it looks like modern abstraction, it therefore is the original abstraction, we destroy the profound nuance of global art history.
But by finally separating those strands, the truth about the Western canon becomes undeniable. If we return to that 1958 MoMA exhibition that we discussed at the beginning of the show, the institutional claim of total, vacuum-sealed originality crumbles entirely.
The narrative of a massive rupture.
Right. The MoMA narrative sold abstract expressionism as a massive rupture, an unprecedented break from everything that came before in human history. But the subsequent, undeniable fascination that Western artists had with East Asian calligraphic line exposed a massive contradiction in that narrative.
It changed the historical perspective.
It did. What looked unprecedented in New York suddenly looked less original when seen beside older brush traditions whose gestural intelligence had been cultivated for centuries.
We can absolutely agree on that nuanced truth. Calligraphy should not be flattened into a catchy museum slogan like the original abstract art. That erases its rich linguistic and cultural soul.
It is reductive.
It is.
But the staunch proponents of modern Western abstraction must concede that their movement absolutely did not emerge from a vacuum. Modern art did not invent the expressive line. It canonized one highly specific, non-representational version of a much older human discovery.
This realization forces us to reconsider how we interact with these objects today. Whether we are curators, historians, or simply gallery visitors, the practical implications are significant. How do we change our approach practically?
Well, we need to start teaching gesture as observable, physical data, rather than treating it as inexplicable mysticism. When we present grass script or gestural painting to students, we should direct their attention to the physical realities, the speed of the wrist, the pressure of the bristles, the intentional deviation from standard form.
grounding it in biomechanics.
Yes. Furthermore, we need to rigorously audit the museum language that we inherited from the 1980s and 1990s market boom. We need to strip away the flattening, market-driven comparisons to Pollock and Klein, where they obscure the actual philosophical and historical context of the older work.
Furthermore, museum exhibitions need to be designed around true function and philosophy, not just superficial visual resemblance. Grouping a 10th century ink scroll and a 1950s oil painting in the same room, purely because they share a chaotic black line, does a massive disservice to the viewer.
It creates false equivalencies.
Exactly. If we build thematic rooms focused on ritual, physical discipline, and the transmission of sacred text, viewers will finally understand why visually similar marks can belong to entirely different conceptual worlds.
We have to treat them as co-equal systems.
We need to invest in comparative scholarship that treats these ancient traditions as co-equal, incredibly sophisticated intellectual systems, not just as primitive precursors or aesthetic fodder for European modernism.
This leaves us with a lingering, provocative question to consider as we look back at the history of art and human invention. If our understanding of abstraction was so narrowly, so rigidly shaped by one specific century of Western painting, we have to ask, what other foundational human discoveries are we currently mislabeling simply because they do not fit neatly into our modern categories?
This is the Research Desk, officially signing off.